So I'm here today to tell you a simple story. It's a story about citizenship, responsibility, and dare I say, maybe even morality. It's a story that when I shared with some of those close to me before I came out here, they said in a very cautionary way that maybe I should not tell this story because it may make some of you feel uncomfortable. My response when I got that feedback was perfect. So here's my story. This is what I'd like to share. I have one of those jobs that unfortunately requires that I spend a lot of time on airplanes. And not too long ago, I boarded a flight like I always do, took my seat, and as I was drifting off to sleep, the pilot came over the public address system. Two young soldiers had boarded the airplane and took seats just a few rows in front of me, and the pilot asked everyone in the plane to thank them and acknowledge their service to this country. And there was a polite round of applause on the airplane, and those close enough to reach the two young men, gave them a handshake and a pat on the back. And I couldn't help but notice as this was going on, the woman sitting next to me was making a particular show of her support, so much so that I began to wonder if this was as much about her as it was those two soldiers. So I am a social scientist by academic training, and I have been known to do, let's say, impromptu social experiments in situations like this. So I decided at this point I was going to engage this woman in a conversation. And I told her I was a military veteran myself. I told her that today I direct a large academic institute at Syracuse University focused on the social and economic concerns of this nation's 22.5 million military veterans. And with that, she was hooked. I got her. And she travels a lot like me. And one of the first things she said to me was that whenever she's in an airport and she sees a soldier, she makes sure to say thank you for your service. I thanked her for her gesture, but then began to subtly, or maybe not so subtly, shift the direction of the conversation a little bit to some of the challenges that are facing particularly this generation of military veterans. I told her, for example, that many of this generation of veterans, particularly the youngest, have struggled mightily to find jobs when they come home and leave service, and that maybe some of those struggles are a function of the fact that many of these young men and women who have served over the last 12 years are leaving military service with disabilities at a rate unprecedented in U.S. history. Conservatively, 30% of them will live out the rest of their lives with disabilities connected to her service. And the more I talked, the more agitated she became. But what did me in, what did the conversation in, was when I told her about the suicides. When I told her that 20% of this nation's suicides are military veterans, even though they represent less than 10% of our population. When I told her that 22 military veterans a day commit suicide in this country, one every 80 minutes, I told her that by the time we land, 3 more will have taken their own lives. I told her that in recent years, more veterans have died by their own hand than service members lost to the enemy in Iraq and Afghanistan. And at this point, she looked at me like I had 2 heads, and she said, "None of this can be true. This isn't Vietnam. Didn't you see us clap for those soldiers? America supports our veterans." She proceeded to pull out her iPad, pop on her headphones, and turn on a rerun of Home and Garden TV. I knew it was a rerun because I like that channel. I watch those shows all the time. But she was clearly done with me. And honestly, I sat there and thought maybe I had gone too far with my little experiment. And then a young man, couldn't have been more than 24, 25 years old, sitting on the other side of the aisle, tapped me on the shoulder and looked me square in the eye, stuck out his hand, and he simply said, "Thanks." And it turns out his name was Tim. Tim was a military veteran. Tim volunteered and enlisted in the Marine Corps when he was 18 years old, served for 5 years. 3 of those 5 years he spent in Iraq or Afghanistan. He got out just about 6 months ago, and he had a plan. He was going to go to school. And he seemed ashamed to tell me that he only lasted about 2 months on his college campus because he said, I just didn't feel like I fit in. I didn't feel like I belonged. I had nothing in common with my classmates, with my teachers, with my administrators. He'd been trying to find a job, no luck so far, and he told me he's really hoping that the docs at the VA can figure out how to stop the ringing in his ears so he can get more than 2 or 3 hours of sleep each night. And you know what? To be very honest with you, because of what I do, I've heard all that before. None of that necessarily surprised me. But what hit me like a punch in the gut is what he said next. His eyes welled up and he said, Mike, worst of all, worse than all of that is since I've been home, I feel anonymous. And at that moment, I turned and looked at the woman who was sitting next to me, and she's lost in her reality TV. And Tim was not the only one at that moment looking for a tissue to wipe his eyes. Now home among the very people who sent him to war, he feels anonymous. I'd ask you to reflect on that for a second. In 2012, at the Aspen Institute's Ideas Festival, General Stanley McChrystal became the first senior commander of the post-9/11 generation of military leaders to make a public call for a return to the draft. His argument was never again should the cost and consequences of war be so disconnected from society and its citizens. Nobody paid him any attention. It made the news for about a day. So, post-Vietnam, it was America's response to Vietnam that largely served as the impetus for the creation of the all-volunteer force. After Vietnam, the idea of conscription and mandatory military service for all was widely rejected by all Americans. Still today, it is the all-volunteer force model that has the overwhelming support of Americans and, quite honestly, most military leaders. Importantly, however, we are coming off the first extended test of the all-volunteer force. And as with any test, it's my hope, and certainly our collective hope, that we may have learned something. Let me tell you what I have learned. What I have learned is that the moral outrage that galvanized much of America after Vietnam was subsequently translated into policy and then practice in a way that actually runs counter to the idea that war is something to be avoided at all costs. In fact, the all-volunteer force makes it much too easy for us to leverage military conflict as an instrument of public policy. Since 1973, when the all-volunteer force was enacted, our leaders have actually used force as an instrument of policy at an escalating rate. In the 40 years since the all-volunteer force has been in existence, our military leaders have sent our men and women of the military into harm's way 134 separate times. In the 40 years prior to the all-volunteer force, when all of our citizens were responsible for our defense, our leaders used force 24 times. Why is Tim anonymous? Tim is anonymous because we have disconnected the costs and consequences of war from all of you. Over the course of the last 12 years at war, the burden of that war has been shouldered by less than 1% of all Americans. Because of that fact, odds are Tim is not your brother, your father, your son, your neighbor, your classmate, your teammate. He's probably not even your friend. And because of that fact, far too many Americans are not invested in Tim's future. But let me tell you, Tim is somebody. Tim is the somebody that we, all of you, collectively entrusted and conferred this nation's moral compass when you sent him off to find fight, and kill our enemies. And now he's home, and just like that woman sitting next to me on the airplane, not enough of you, not enough of us are invested in his future. So here's the thing. Let me tell you about Tim. History and those who have come before Tim have proven to history that he's smart, educated, resourceful, and entrepreneurial. He wants to be a leader in your communities, on your campuses, and in your governments. He's mature beyond his years, he's honest to a fault, and he's fiercely loyal. Sure, war has changed him, but on so many dimensions, more for the better than for the worse. Thomas Jefferson said that a nation as a society forms a moral person, and that all members are responsible for society. I stand here and attest to you today that when you made the decision to defer the defense of this country to Tim, you made a moral choice that incurs a moral obligation. What is that obligation? It's a very, very simple thing. It's the only thing that Tim wants from you. Tim wants you to know him. I implore you, find a way to know Tim. Thank you.